I want to talk about two verses that are found in Psalm 36, and those verses are verses 5 and 6. Your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Your righteousness is like the mountains of God. Your judgments are like the great deep. Man and beast you save, O Lord. Psalm 36 is believed to be one of the oldest psalms in the Bible. And what is remarkable about it for me is that in spite of its great age, the message of these two verses couldn't be more needed in the 21st century. Something else that's quite striking about these verses is its use of language. The psalmist is able, by the language that he chooses, to achieve a huge amount with so very few words. I guess this is what poetry can do in general, and ancient Hebrew poetry in particular is characterized by its terseness, and so its form demands that the words work extra hard. And we certainly see that here. Now, the main purpose of these verses is to highlight and to celebrate the greatness of God's attributes. And these are grouped into two pairs. You have the steadfast love and the faithfulness of God as the first pair, and then you have the righteousness and the judgment of God as being the second pair. But the psalmist's words are drawing us in to associate God's love, faithfulness, righteousness, and judgment with creation itself. What we are being reminded of here is that creation is more than just the context within which God's drama is being played out. It isn't merely the location where God's goodness is expressed towards the human race, the stage on which God saves humanity. It is a player, a performer in its own right in this great cosmic drama. God's love extends, we are told, to the clouds, and his faithfulness to the heavens. Heavens, by the way, means sky in this context. And they do this because God's goodness is profoundly involved and entwined with the universe which he created and which he declared to be very good. And God's righteousness is like the mountains, not just because it is big, and his judgments are like the deep, not just because they are profoundly wise, but because God is profoundly concerned with the processes that form the mountains and that shape the deepest parts of the oceans. The processes of creation, from continental drift to the falling of a leaf in autumn, are a matter of justice and wisdom for the God of righteousness. The psalmist states this as clearly as he can when he says that the Lord saves man and beast in verse 6. God's saving love and righteousness are directed towards creation as well as towards humanity. And this makes so much sense in every way. A popular belief among some Christians is that when we die, we go to heaven and spend the rest of eternity there. And I can appreciate that this gives many people a great deal of comfort, especially if their experience of this world has been so painful that they dearly wish to escape it. But one potential and unfortunate side effect of this belief is that it can make creation surplus to requirements. And this can lead to a dismissal of the importance of creation. We could fall into the trap of thinking that we don't need planet Earth if we are destined to spend eternity in heaven. But the vision the Bible sets before us is of a renewed planet Earth and a renewed universe. Creation isn't the temporary set-in of our present troubles. It is the location and the context for God's eternal plans. More than that, it's the focus of his saving activity. Paul tells us this in Romans chapter 8 and in verses 20 to 22, where he says, "For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now." When we recognize that our future hope is tied to the future of creation, then creation itself takes on a greater importance. Creation becomes something to love and to care for because God loves and cares for it, and because it is so much a part of who we are now and who we shall be in eternity. And so this brings us to the important question as far as these verses are concerned, which is, in what way does God save man and beast? Well, it seems as though the psalmist has in mind the work of God in sustaining the ecosystems that are integral to all life. What is fascinating about this is that this ancient writer doesn't have a worldview that places humanity in a privileged position over the rest of creation. He sees creation itself, animals and their environments, as the focus of divine love and the recipients of divine grace. But perhaps we have a better perspective on creation's need for salvation than our ancient poet did. We view these words from the vantage point of a scientific understanding of just how our actions have impacted the world around us. Perhaps people in the psalmist's day might have looked at the world and thought it was impossible for creatures as small as humans to make any kind of dent in its fortunes. But humanity had already by then significantly changed the planet. Many thousands of years before this psalm was written, our hunter-gatherer ancestors had already caused a mass extinction event as they hunted large mammal species into oblivion. Animals such as the woolly mammoth, the giant beaver, the giant sloth, they disappeared from our planet forever, and the ecosystems that they supported were profoundly impacted. Then after that, but still some 10,000 years ago, farming was invented, and it was invented simultaneously in numerous parts of the world. And vast areas of forest were cleared at that time to make way for newly domesticated crops and for grazing newly domesticated animals. The result was a significant rise in CO2 levels in the atmosphere and a rise in global temperatures as a result. A rise in global temperatures that was in fact so large that it had the effect of postponing the next ice age. Humans have always impacted the world in a profound way. None of this, of course, can compare to the effect that we've had on biodiversity, atmospheric and oceanic pollution levels, and climate since the globalization of trade in the 17th century, the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries, and what environmental historians call the Great Acceleration since 1945. The acceleration, that is, of our polluting effect on the world and destructive effect on its biodiversity. And so we are confronted by a creation that is loved by God and that is the focus of God's passion for righteousness and justice, but which we, the human race, have unalterably damaged. Worse than this, a creation whose exploitation and abuse has even at some points been encouraged by the church. As we've seen for years, the church's vision of its own salvation has actively worked against the salvation of creation. We don't need to care about climate change because we're going to heaven for all eternity. For years, these verses have been meaningless to an indifferent church. And so we are called to have a new understanding of creation and our place within it. Whether our hope is for a temporary existence in heaven before a bodily resurrection, or for a resurrection without heaven, we can no longer see ourselves as separate from creation, somehow existing above it and with rights over it. We need to have an understanding of ourselves that displays greater humility and that sees ourselves as being a part of God's created world, integrated into it in such a way that all our actions have implications for the lives of animals and plants alike. We need to abandon the human-centered view of the world in favor of a more God-centered one. Madagascar is currently experiencing a terrible famine. Pacific Islanders are being displaced from their homes, which are now flooded by rising sea levels. Both of these events are the direct cause of climate change, and they are both happening now. This isn't theory, it is reality. And so we need to adopt a more biblical understanding of our future hope as being tied to God's plans for planet Earth, so that we can no longer dismiss the various environmental and climate crises that we face, so that we see that our futures have been invested in the planet on which we live. When individual Christians take these responsible steps of changing how we think about ourselves, creation, and God, then we can begin to take seriously the responsibility we bear to the creation that is so loved by God. And then we can play our own role in God's plan to save the world.